Elix is a game about building your own empire. In this game, the class of the character is determined by the ability checks that are made when you start the game for the first time. According to the plot of the game, the player must develop his vassals and gain trust from the Duke, then explore the dungeon and show all his skills and build a perfect empire. Before the game starts, the man with the monocle asks permission to start by introducing himself. It turns out his name is Bill Will, and he is the guide in the Elix game and is in charge of the briefing session. It turns out that after the game has gone through a long and difficult path of beta testing, it has finally opened its official server to all players. Bill also emphasizes that he hopes that this time all players will get the most out of the game. But suddenly he crawls out of his hat and says that he forgot to say the most important thing. It turns out that players should behave with extreme caution. It turns out that in this game, if the king dies, the empire and all its vassals will cease to exist. And if the ruler is incompetent or lazy, the archdukes will stage a coup d'etat and take away all his power. But the most important point of this game is that if the player allows his death in the game, it will only mean that he will leave this world. And in real life, Bill, after all, asks us to stay alive. Our story begins with the fact that we are shown an old hut and a young guy who is in the hut watching a gorilla bringing in another prisoner. The people begged the gorilla to spare them and let them go home. But of course, the gorilla was not going to help them. After all, they were not their prisoners. At that moment, some guy asks the protagonist why these gorillas keep them here. Of course, the protagonist immediately decided to ask first what this guy's name is. It turned out that his name is Kwak Jong-han. Upon hearing this, the protagonist says that the gorilla needs to depose the village headman in order to strengthen his faction. He draws his new friend's attention to another gorilla who has been sent to prison with them to emphasize his powerlessness. But then, paying attention to the color of the guy's skin, the protagonist says that since the signs of his race have already manifested, he can safely make a deal with their leader. Then Kwak got very agitated about it. He panicked. I reported that he had not completed the aptitude test, and therefore this meant that he had no one to turn to. At this point, the protagonist calms the guy down and says that he thinks he might have met him somewhere before in real life. Then, referring to another person, the protagonist wonders if his new friend is not a fisherman by any chance. Then Kwak says that it is not true and he is a swimmer. Hearing this, the main character states that it is not surprising that he could see this man on TV. It turns out that on the first day when the protagonist got here after meeting with the game's guide Beal, all the players set out to build their empires, but some players simply had nowhere to go. One of those people is his new friend, because his empire was destroyed already during the beta test. These are the players who did not have an empire behind them, joined another player named Kim Gap-jun, who is quite good at this game. After everyone united, they founded a small village and tried to survive somehow. But one day suddenly appeared Archduke of the Kural tribe, who because of the weakness of their ruler was able to gather his supporters and make a coup, taking all the power to himself. It is for this reason that the protagonist, along with his new friend and some other players they met at the entrance, were imprisoned. It turns out that in the real world, all these people are very different from each other. For example, one of the players whose real name is Jae Young just went to high school, and the other player, Baek Do Hyun, is a regular office worker. Turns out, even despite the fact that all these people have been playing this game for a while, they still chose to stay in this place rather than return to their empires. Naturally, knowing all this, the protagonist thinks about what he should do. He thinks that it cannot be that he does not know about his king. So he decides that voluntarily or forcibly, he will someday return to his empire anyway. At this point, Hu grabs the protagonist's hand and tells him not to worry because he has a place to go. According to him, once the guys get a chance to leave this place, they can't live in this guy's empire. Turns out he wants to take the main character there with him, just because he did him a big favor by helping him when they first met. The young man decides that he will also help the protagonist because his race has not yet manifested itself, which made the protagonist embarrassed, and it turned out that he was just hiding his race from Jae-young and all the other people. But suddenly one of the people in the room, that office worker, says that maybe the protagonist is just hiding his race. He suggests that maybe it's because the protagonist is one of the 1,000-faced people. But these words very much angered Jae-young, who reacted rudely to the words of this guy and immediately angrily asked if he was talking to this bespectacled man. Of course, the protagonists were not happy about this display of aggression. Such a pressure from the young man made the bespectacled man silent and even a little scared. But then the young man told the protagonist that even if he is a representative of the race of the thousand-faced, it still does not change anything, and he even says that such a race is very suitable for the protagonist. The protagonist, of course, thanked his friend, but still thought that he had paid him a very dubious compliment, at which point a notification appears asking for permission to run a character merge. At this point, the young guy looks very angry, his face very much showing the veins he was now experiencing. This was immediately noticed by the protagonist, who asked his friend what was going on with him. But then the latter looked away and asked the guy didn't hear anything strange. Naturally, the protagonist immediately says that he didn't hear anything at all. But then the young man states that he thinks there is someone upstairs in their house. Naturally, the protagonist did not immediately understand what his friend is talking about and thought that someone is in the sky. And suddenly he realized that if someone is in the sky, it will not end too well. Suddenly, at this point in their house, something hits their house with tremendous force that even made the house explode. At that moment, all the prisoners who were in the barn became very worried. Then Kwak Jong-han also asked what the sound was heard outside. But at that time, the girl was already ahead of him and only told everyone to look somewhere, because the whole tribe even went outside. Naturally, at first, the protagonist does not understand what all the other people are looking at. But suddenly, turning to the old emperor of this faction, the protagonist asked him if he thinks the same as they do. But this is the moment calmly Gorilla asks what is going on and assumes that someone attacked. He looks very calm and not at all concerned. Then he says that if someone has really invaded this lousy village, then you guys who are outside and who are holding them as prisoners will definitely take care of the problem. And so he doesn't understand why worry. But the protagonist doesn't believe these words and says that apparently it's not that simple. Suddenly, this barn runs into a large gorilla who, addressing everyone present, tells the people in the index tone to all go outside. Naturally, people don't understand why they should go out, because the weapons are much more dangerous than here, and they are prisoners. But then the protagonist also began to convince his friends that they urgently need to get out of this place, because it can be many times more dangerous here than outside. Of course, at first, nobody wanted to leave the house, but then the main character decisively told his friend that it was time for them to leave. And then, naturally, everyone decided to follow their example. Suddenly turning his gaze to the sky, the main character noticed in the sky airship. But looking closely, he saw that there is not one airship but 4. Naturally, it surprised him very much and even seemed strange. He didn't understand why 4 ships would be sent to attack a small village, and he thought that maybe those ships weren't after them. But he was well aware that there could be no other purpose in this place. Then the former orangutan emperor took a closer look at the ships and told everyone that he had already seen a sign like the one on these airships. He immediately declared that this was the Empire of Deadly Poisons. At this point, the protagonist thinks about it. He realizes that if this is really the Deadly Poison Empire, it's not so strong. It has a rather low rating. At this point, his blue-skinned friend asks what happened and why these people are attacking them. Then the protagonist tells him that this is very common. At least in this game, their conversation is suddenly interrupted by an orangutan who asks if the guys still think they are toys. He says that to survive in this place, the guys could pull up at least the math part of their knowledge. At this point, the protagonist says that the moment the Empire gets stronger, they start attacking more than just dungeons. But it's not that simple. According to him, due to the fact that all empires are ranked in proportion to the number of players all try to make an alliance with strong empires, at the same time, weak empires surrender to their mercy and become slaves in return for saving their lives. But if they simply resist, the strong empires will kill anyone who gets in their way. Suddenly, the king of the Deadly Poison Empire and a member of the snake race called Autumn addresses all the people below. He points his gun at them and says that if the guys want to stay alive, their leader must stay and give up all the people. In case of refusal, he threatens that they will open fire on all these people. But the emperor of the gorilla race declares that he will not surrender. According to him, his time A never gives up and fiercely fights all his opponents. At this moment, the former leader of the race is watching his heir and says that his words are like a laughingstock. He does not understand what he can do with 4 airships with such low-grade cannons. At this point, the protagonist does not understand what the serpent is doing here. He realizes that even if the conquest of a weak empire is commonplace, then why is it that since it rules here, it is conquering and their small village, and yet their leader is talking about the people? The protagonist doesn't realize what he's up to, but turning his head sees his friend who begins the transformation. Jae-young quickly began to take on the appearance of his race, and then the protagonists realized that the Igors were surprised by a representative of a race of monsters. But since he cannot allow the guy to transform, the main character grabs his hand and asks him to stay behind him. Naturally, at first, the young guy is puzzled and even unhappy with the decision of his friend. Then it turns out that the protagonist sincerely realizes that monsters are physically the strongest race in the game, but his friend has recently become a monster, and therefore will not be able to fully utilize even the basic skills that his race has. At this moment, the protagonist is frantically trying to make the right decisions and understand what to do in the situation. But suddenly he remembers what race he belongs to. At this point, the King of Times and Snakes is surprised that the people from this village are not going to. In his opinion, they are real dumbasses, and decides that in this case he will have to kill them all. After all, they did not leave him no other choice. Immediately after these words, the airships that were in the sky opened fire on all the people who were below. At this moment, they had nothing left but to watch the incredible power of the guns and enemies. Naturally, all the captives were very much frightened by what they saw and began to beg for mercy, but the protagonist was not like the others. He was standing right in front of the guns and just watched what was happening. It turns out that at this moment he thought about whether this will really be the end. He realizes that both in life and in the game, he can change absolutely nothing and only senselessly die. But suddenly he decides that he wants to move on with his life and wants to escape this whole situation. As suddenly his wish turns into reality and a panel appears in front of him. Naturally, the protagonist does not understand what it is and is surprised to see the panel. But it turns out that this is a system notification that informed the protagonist that the poison defense skill has been activated. He doesn't understand why this is happening now, but he sees a knight standing right in front of the cannons as if protecting the protagonist. At this point, he thinks about the fact that poison defense is the very first skill that he received. It turns out that he has long wanted to get at least some skill in order to increase the characteristics of his game character. It's as if he mentally starts communicating with the knight who protects him and guesses that he gained this skill to protect his vassals. Also, he suddenly realized that the game screen has disappeared. And at this moment, before his eyes, stood the masculine figure of the same knight who looks just like the one known to the protagonist of the man. At this moment, he even let a tear. But the Snake Race Emperor was not at all happy about the appearance of this young man and could not even understand what was going on at first. But suddenly, at one point, it all made sense to him, and he realized that the Black Empire had interceded for these people. Naturally, he doesn't understand why Beckia is here. Suddenly, the guy snaps his fingers and the airships that belonged to the deadly Poison Empire suddenly exploded. Of course, the protagonist was very frightened by this, and even remembered his words that there is no way that the Archduchess did not know about his king. He suddenly grabs you by the chest and realizes that most likely this is his end, because he did not expect that this duke will come himself. At this moment, the Archduke, who managed to defeat alone all the enemies, approaches the protagonist. Behind the duke's back, we see two wings that have different colors. One of the wings was white and the other black. We also learned that the Archduke's name is Ruhak. At this moment, to the main character and the surviving guys approaches another man who was also a prisoner with them. They thought that he was dead, because for quite a long time they could not find him. Well then, the former employee, who again resents something, says that maybe it's the protagonist himself who died, because everything is fine with him. And he also turns to the protagonist and says that most likely he knows what sins the happiness has fallen on them for. At this point, the guy says inaudibly that he doesn't understand what the young man is asking about. But the office worker immediately noticed that the young man can't lie at all. He says that the protagonist looks at that guy in armor so tenderly as if he were dying to love him. He naturally noticed it immediately, and so decided to chat with the protagonist. But it turns out that the fact that their lives were saved, he did not care at all. And at that very minute, he grabbed the protagonist and started shaking him hard, and wanted to find out some information from him. At this point, One of the Archduke's warriors interceded for his king and struck his sword between them to make the office worker move away. Naturally, he immediately looked at the man and explicitly told him to go away quickly and leave their king alone. Naturally, the guy immediately got scared and said he would do it, but asked the knight to put his sword away. Immediately after this incident, the Archduke himself approaches the protagonist and, emphasizing that he does not understand what he forgot in this place, asks him if he will stop doing nonsense. But then the protagonist was embarrassed to emphasize that his Etzgerza had surprisingly appeared at the most dangerous moment. So he even suggests that he might have been waiting for a better moment to make his presence known. But then the Archduchess said that such a thing is absolutely impossible because there is no such Archduchess who would like to see his king in danger. He even asks the protagonist about it. But suddenly he abruptly grabs his king by the head and says that naturally his words are true. Except their king carefully hides the signs of his race, at which point he moves his hand along the protagonist's back to check where his wings are. Suddenly, he puts his hand right under the main character's clothes and he naturally starts to resist asking not to do it. But he doesn't succeed, and so wings suddenly appear from his back. Naturally, all his friends began to worry about the protagonist, except for the office worker who realized that this guy really is a representative of the celestial race. He realizes that the protagonist was the master of Bekia, a power that was wrested by his own hands from the entire empire. He also knows about the fact that the guy was a king who raised his empire to the top of the lowest ranking. And so he was also the very king who was himself ranked number 1 in the power rankings. But at that moment, the Archduke pressed his king's hand to his chest, and looking directly at him, he emphasizes that what he wants to know most right now is the real reason why the protagonist gave up his empire and hid in a place like this with these people. Then the protagonist, a little embarrassed, started joking and said that the fact that his Archduke doesn't have any information is really amazing. But the Archduke saw no reason to joke, and hinting to the lad that he would again show the same with his hand, asks, does he really need to kill all his friends one by one for the protagonist to deign to answer? Sehyun, who of course didn't want this, was disturbed by such words and asked his friends not to be hurt. He ordered that no one be killed. But then the Archduke asks his king, does he really not realize that he's going to have to kill all these people anyway? But the protagonist desperately fights with his subordinate for the right to life of his friends and declares in the end that he needs all these people very much. He also asks if it is the Archduke's duty to follow the king's orders. Then the protagonist, already as the king of the celestial race, asks his Archduke to accept the surrender of the king of the deadly poison empire and take him into custody, as well as ensure the safety of all the people who stand behind him. He also tells his subordinate to do nothing without his orders. He also asks that the Archduke not forget that among all those people there is also the king of the monster race, and therefore he should keep this fact in mind. According to the protagonist, this is an order. But suddenly, he changes in his face and does not understand what is happening. It turns out he is experiencing very strange sensations in his body, and suggests that perhaps this is all and close the lion. We learn that the protagonist is experiencing weakness and dizziness, but he still says that if Rukak obeys even one of his orders, he will not silently watch it. But suddenly his eyes began to darken, after which the newly minted king fell without strength right into the hands of his subordinate. At first, he doesn't realize what's going on. But suddenly, a system window appears in front of him that asks if the protagonist wants to unify the attributes of the race. Also, the system notifies him that after making a choice, the decision will be impossible to change. Then he decided to merge the attributes, and the system notified him that the process had been successful. It turns out he only did it to hurt the Duke, who asked him to listen to his orders. In real life, the protagonist tries to understand why everything happened the way it did. And suddenly he sees a new window that notifies him that there is a check on the reliability of the Archduke, and therefore a dialogue with him will be held. It turns out that in a dialogue with his subordinate, the protagonist states that he is actually very much in love with his subordinate, but then he gets a response from the Archduke who says that he hates him. Naturally, the protagonist did not want this to happen, but suddenly, as if in real life, the Archduke appears before him and asks the protagonist if he is really the culprit of all this. Suddenly, he woke up again in the world of the game, but this time it happened right in the arms of the Archduke. Naturally, the young man was very surprised and frightened by what he saw. He loudly asked his subject what he was doing to him right now. His shout was so loud it was audible to the entire empire. At this point, we learn some details about the protagonist's past. There are two people arguing about why they should take care of the protagonist. One of them says he can't do anything about it and asks the other if he thinks he likes it. But then the second person wonders why they don't just send the protagonist to an orphanage. Naturally, these people realize that no one will accept such an adult child. But still, the whole situation is very annoying. It turns out that the treatment of the protagonist when he was a teenager was not the best. One day, when the bullies tried to take away one thing from him, he said that he would not give it back. Of course, the bully was not happy about it and says that he will just borrow this thing for a while. But then, the main character who stood on the floor confidently said that he would not give this thing to him because it was not bought by his mother but by his own labor. The boy states that he worked and earned this gadget himself. Naturally, these words made the bullies laugh even more and sarcastically praise the protagonist. But then one of them towered over him and said that they should clarify something. The main one of them even wondered if the protagonist really didn't have parents who could buy new headphones for him. At this point, they start insulting his parents and even say that he doesn't have any friends. According to him, the main character must be very hard, and that's why he doesn't want to give up his thing. The bully also emphasizes that his parents probably abandoned him because of his character. It turns out that it was because of all this that the main character could not feel safe and comfortable, not at home, not at school. That's why after he graduated from school, he decided to immediately pack his things and move. Having made such a difficult decision, he ran away from the house in which he lived and found a small but cheap room. Of course, the guy could afford it because he earned his own living. But acting in this way at one point, the protagonist realized the fact that he was left all alone. It turned out that he had no time to think about the university or his friends, because when he came home from work, he immediately fell into bed and stuck to his phone. But all this could not last forever. And one day, a young man heard some mysterious voice that asked him if they could play a little game. At first, he thought it was a game too expensive for him, but he still bought it. But after he was tested for abilities, it turned out that he was assigned to the angel race, which was considered the weakest in the game. After realizing that it is impossible to pass the ability test repeatedly, he realized that his fighting golden angels is the final choice. We learn that this subspecies has attributes made of gold, and also that basic skills can be checked in the skill window after completing the ability test. It was when the protagonist decided to play for such a weak race that he realized that his vassals took the brunt of the shame of being the weakest race because of his incompetence, which is why he realized that his vassals were not just NPCs to him, but the only ones who stood by his side. It was for this reason that the protagonist became so strongly attached to his people, because unlike him, he realized that they lived in the hope of becoming stronger and conquering all other empires. It is in the hope of becoming stronger they dirty their snow-white wings, which are the symbols of their empire. And it turns out that this is why the Archduke tells the protagonist that he hates him. But the action moves us back to the game, and there the protagonist asks his Archduke to let him go. But he once again did not think to execute the order, and asked the king to just calm down, because he is just redeeming him. At this point, the protagonist, being even more frightened, says that he means exactly that, because he does not understand why this case is being handled by such a high-ranking official in his empire. But then, looking directly at his king, the Ruhak asks who else to do the job. But then the protagonist pushes his subordinate and tells him to stop, because he can do everything on his own. He even asks him to go away and leave him alone. At that moment, because of the jolt to his chest with which he tried to alienate his subordinate, the protagonist fell right into the water. At that moment, all the splashes of water that the king of the empire fell into fell directly on the Archduke. Realizing what he had done, the protagonist timidly apologized to his servant. But after he came out of the bathroom, he wondered where he was. And also suddenly the protagonist wondered where the people who were with me were. Naturally, his subject was a little surprised by this, because his king had just woken up and immediately began to question him about some people. According to him, he kept them all alive, as was the order on the protagonists. But he still says that he feels very strongly that the emperor does not remember his empire at all. The protagonist is even a little surprised by these words, Suddenly, he looks outside and wonders if this place is really his empire. But after a closer look at all the structures, he realizes that it really is. It looks exactly as he saw it on the screen. Then he said that he could not forget his empire, which naturally was not believed by the Archduke, who emphasized that these words were spoken by the very man who had left them all and gone away. Upon hearing these words, the protagonist tried to justify himself somehow and said that he did not leave anyone, but at the same time states that even if he tells the true reason for leaving, his subjects will still not be able to fully understand him. At the same time, he emphasizes that it is unlikely that the Archduke missed him, and therefore he suddenly wonders why he found him, and even wonders if it is not enough that he just lived. It turns out that the protagonist is well aware that he destroyed the empire with his own hands, and therefore does not know what will happen. He thinks that maybe the Ruhak is trying to punish him for this deed. Norukak, having fully listened to his king, says that he is very sorry if he really considers this a punishment. He states that the merging of attributes will soon be completed. Of course, these words scare the protagonist incredibly much, and even make him think. But after only a couple seconds, his look changed, and he started to look quite sad. It turns out that on that day, everyone in the empire changed race, and one wing became black. But only the king's wings did not change their color. It turns out at that moment, he also wanted to feel the bitterness of change. Hearing these words, Rukak says that it will be even better for the king, because at least he will no longer faint from the mere appearance of wings. Naturally, the guy is surprised to hear this and asks if it will really be that easy. He also wonders what will happen if he says he doesn't want it all. But then the Archduke says that in such a case, they can use strong means if necessary, and assures that they will definitely do so if necessary. Hearing these threats against him, the king asked to stop this conversation. But then his subordinate said that it would be better if the protagonist would not try to hide his wings, because the wings of the king and the Archduke are the symbol of the empire, which should be seen by everyone even outside its walls. Then the protagonist says that he agrees to all the conditions that have been put to him, and also says that he will agree to the unification of the attributes, and that he will never hide his wings. He assures Ruhak that he will do as he says, but in return he wants permission to meet with those people with whom he has been locked up. Naturally, Ruhak is surprised by these words, and asks if his king will really obey him so easily. Well then, the protagonist says that if he doesn't get the permission he's asking for, the wings he owns may no longer be considered a symbol of the empire. Hearing these words, Ruhak was incredibly furious. He immediately grabbed the king by the face and said that he is very much mistaken when he says such things, and emphasizes that only thanks to these wings he still looks after him. According to the Archduke, the king cannot so easily give them up. At this point, the protagonist says that this is true but emphasizes that he can still try to do it. Upon hearing these words, the subject immediately grabs his king and throws him on the bed. He towered over the lad and asked if he really wanted to try it, for he threatens the Archduke with his wings, but trembles at the slightest touch of them. Immediately after these words, the subject touched the king's wings and thus gave him great pleasure. At this point, the protagonist realized what was happening, and he suddenly didn't understand why his joystick had tensed from the normal touch of the wings. But Ruhak did not stop playing with the wings of the protagonist, and even began to lick them. At this point, you could see on the face of the protagonist that he liked it very much. He even began to shiver and his face changed. Naturally, he could not resist such an effect and only wondered how it could happen and why he liked it so much. He decided to ask the Ruhak this question and immediately asked him why his body reacted the way it did to normal touches to his wings. He also emphasizes that these sensations are quite strange and unusual for him, at which point, Ruhak declares that this is indeed the case and emphasizes that this has never happened to them before. Hearing these words and feeling indescribable feelings, the protagonist asks Ruka to stop doing it, but then he only asked why he should obey the king's order, because he likes it very much. After these words, the Archduke added pressure, and biting his wings a little began to do everything much more intensely than before. At this point, the protagonist's body couldn't take it anymore, and he finally let his hand know that he should stop playing with his wings, at which point he gets out of bed and declares that it was worth it. Ruhak also emphasizes that he is obliged to emphasize the fact that he did it only out of good intentions, at which point the red-faced and trembling protagonist looks at his subject. But his views have no effect on Ruhak, and he only states that the protagonist needs to be washed again. Naturally, these words scare the young man, and he says that no one needs to do it. Still with a very worried look, but a face red with pleasure, he says that this time he will handle the process himself, and asks the Archduke not to touch him anymore. Immediately after these words and a brief glance of the hands says that the king's clothes are still not ready, and asks the king not to even think about you getting out of this place. Naturally, the protagonist is very surprised to hear such words, and immediately asking if he can only be in this place, he asks the hand to stop and says that he needs to meet the people to make sure they are safe. At this point, the king tries to get out of bed and run to Ruhak to explain the situation to him in more detail. But suddenly he falls to the floor and does not understand what is happening to his legs. When the protagonist looks around, he notices that he is wearing shackles on his legs that will definitely keep him in this room. Then the departing hand tells him to sit still until he returns. After the Archduke left, the protagonist spread out on the floor and wondered if his subject had really just gone and left him chained in this room. It turns out that, to be completely honest, the protagonist had hoped that the feeling of longing would be stronger than the feeling of hatred, and he hoped that's why Rukak took him from captivity. At that moment, he recalls the words about the king preparing for the merging of attributes, and then the protagonist realizes that he is still hoping for something. It turns out he's still perfectly aware that all he has to do is suffer, but he still doesn't understand why he washed him and touched his wings so tenderly. He doesn't understand whether someone really behaves like this with the person he hates. At this point, he even almost cried, all started to feel very strange and mixed feelings. He realizes that if he continues to think about such things, he will only make himself worse, because in this situation, he does not need to do it. Then, looking at his chained legs, the protagonist realizes that it is time for him to come to his senses. He realizes that every action of Ruhak had a certain meaning, and also realizes that Ruhak will continue to control him. The protagonist believes that in order to get out of this situation, he must first gain the trust of the Archduke. He suddenly realizes that while he is locked up here, he will not be able to do so. But he hopes that by waiting for the connection of the attributes, he may become stronger. But the protagonist also accepts the fact that this may not change anything. He doesn't understand if he can handle the criticism of the citizens of his empire who will accuse him of abandoning them to their fate. In this case, the king thinks that maybe he would be better if he was alone, as Ruhak said. But at this moment, the guy remembers moments from the past when he was also all alone. And because of this, he feels that everything inside him began to shrink from the bitterness and pain of this situation. He immediately began to wonder if his friends were okay, and wondered what would happen if he never saw them again. It turns out that the greatest fear of a king of such a strong empire is only the fear of being all alone, which makes him sometimes go even to the most desperate measures. At this time, all of the main characters' friends were locked in a room in the Empire of the Celestial Race. Jae-young is naturally unhappy with the situation and banging on the door loudly asking to be let out of the place. Seeing his worried look and troubled nature, the blue-skin guy asks him to calm down and asks what will happen if they are actually heard by someone in the place. Then the guy asks his friend in a rude tone what he thinks he's knocking on the door for, thus implying that his purpose is precisely so that someone will hear them. They start fighting, while the guy from the office watches them and wonders if these two are not brothers because they act just like brothers. At this point, the former king of the gorilla race asks the guys to be glad that they are not yet in a dungeon, where they will be much worse than here. At this point, the office clerk wondered how the protagonist did not immediately get to his state and why he reacted strangely every time it came to empires. The office plankton, by simple calculations, realizes that most likely the main character is a king who is not particularly expected by his own citizens, but at the same time he remembered the face of Ruhak at the moment when he saved them and realized that on his face it was obviously written that he was doing something. He also remembered the moment of tenderness when Ruhak had embraced the king and wondered, is this really how defeated kings are treated? At this point, a still very much concerned Jae-young asks what they can do in case that black-winged man tortures Hyun. Upon hearing this question, the blue-skinned boy states that he has heard that if the king dies, his empire will disappear, and so their friend will probably be fine. But then Jae-young says that if they don't die suddenly, there are plenty of other ways he could be bullied besides death. At this moment in his office, Ruhak scrutinizes the very hand that touched the king's wings, at which point he remembers what happened and can't take his eyes off the palm. But one of his subordinates distracts him from looking around and informs him that the king of the Poison Empire has locked the dungeon. Also looking at the new lord of the empire, he wonders if Ruhak is planning to perform the fusion ritual today, specifically for the king. He also emphasizes that the treasury can only be opened by these two, and says that if there is anything else that needs to be prepared, he will definitely do it himself. But then Ruhak says that he cannot perform the ritual today. Of course, his subordinate asks when it will happen, but he hears back an order to tell the others to prepare more magical stones with the elixir of youth. According to Ruhak, it is after this instruction has been fulfilled that they can begin the ritual, but this can only be done after careful preparation for the process. He says that he must not make the slightest mistake in doing so. Naturally, at this point, his subject agreed with his commander's opinion, but immediately stated that he was curious about something. The Ruhak let his knight say what it was that interested him so much. And at this point, the young lad wonders if the king will remain in confinement until the end of the ceremony. Or to be more correct, after the ceremony is over. At this point, Ruhak asks if they have any other way to preserve the empire, thus making it clear that the protagonist will be a prisoner for eternity. At which point, the Archduke argues that they cannot be completely sure that the protagonist will not disappear again if he is released. So he decided that they would leave the king in that room until they were surprised that he was the king who deserved to be in that place. But the young man decides to challenge the decision of the commander-in-chief and asks if the protagonist is not the very king whom everyone was waiting for. Because now it does not even matter for what reason the king left them to their fate. It turns out that for everyone in this empire, the fact that they can just see their true king again is enough. At this moment, looking at the Archduke, he even asks if he has a different opinion on the matter. But he doesn't answer anything. He just thinks about these words. At this time in the room to the main character comes a huge number of servants who apologize for disturbing the king, inform him that they have brought him dinner and specially prepared clothes. They also say that Ruhak asked the servants to make sure that the protagonist had eaten, which is why they say that they will stay here until he finishes his feast. The main character hears these words and hesitates a bit, confused by the fact that Ruhak wants to make sure that he has had dinner, because he is worried that he might have added something to his meaning. He thinks that his Archduke can't be that caring without having a very good reason for it. The protagonist also allows for the fact that the hands may be worried about him not going on a hunger strike. The protagonist realizes that in order to fulfill all the Archduke's plans, he must be alive. But suddenly, at this moment, he begins to feel very strange and even drops the fork from his hands. The main character grabbed his mouth and all shaking began to wonder what is happening to him. It turns out he cannot eat because the food as if stuck in the throat and does not go further. And it's not even about its taste. It turns out he feels as if he ate something inedible and his body rejects it. He suddenly began to look at information about himself, and we learned that the attribute of his race of angels was gold. As he looked at his statistics, he thought again about the fact that on that day, after the change of attribute, everyone in the empire had black wings, and he was the only one who had not changed and remained the same as before. Realizing that in this game, all items are separated strictly by race, perhaps it's all about his difference, and so he assumes that it's because of his white wings that he can't eat. The servants are naturally surprised to see such a reaction from the king and are very excited for. While the protagonist realizes that if he does not eat a bite of all the food brought to him, the Archduke may think he is doing it on purpose. The servants at this time are very excitedly talking among themselves. They realize that if the protagonist does not eat, Ruhak will be very angry with them. But then one of the maids suggested that the protagonist just does not like this menu and asks that her colleague to bring other dishes sooner. So the guy immediately tells the king that he will bring something else right away and asks if the king would like to change his clothes to pass the waiting time. Of course, the protagonist agrees. But at this point, the servants are still in great turmoil because they don't know what Ruhak will tell them about the situation. At this moment in Ruhak's office, the latter declares that everything is now going the way it should, and so he asks his knight to see to it that no problems arise. He declares that it is in this case their king will be able to get freedom faster. But suddenly they hear a knock at the door, and then the furious Ruhak asks who else has come to see him. It turned out that this man was one of those servants who, having apologized for disturbing him, also asked permission to address Ruhak. The latter, realizing that perhaps the matter was connected with the king, immediately inquired what had brought the servant here. Then a very worried servant reported that their king could not eat anything at all. But then Ruhak said that in that case the servant should take other dishes to the king until he could eat. He also emphasized that if he did not start to do so, then let the servant make him eat. Jobel was very surprised at the words he heard and said that they did as they were told. He also emphasized that they tried different dishes to make the king eat, but he spit it all out time after time. Hearing this information, the Archduke thought a little about it. At this time, the protagonist lay in his bed and holding his stomach realized that he is very hungry. He suddenly wanted tteokbokki, also in addition to everything bothers him. Clothing that is completely uncomfortable. Then he pays attention to his wings and thinks about the fact that they are too heavy, and that's why he can't stand on his feet for too long, because it's a really big load for him. It turns out that the young man has not eaten since he was locked up in the village house, but suddenly he remembers the moment when a man from the office asked if the protagonist is not a member of the race of angels. He suddenly wondered if the whole problem is really about race. At this point, he decides to leave all thoughts away and only wonders how to stay calm with such input. At this point in his room came Ruhak, who indignantly stated that the protagonist does not eat anything. Yes, and mumbles something under his nose. It turns out that he assumes that he thinks the student is a mess. Ruhak lets the protagonist know that they expected this. But surprised by such a visit, the main character said that he simply does not have the strength for such a visit. And to everything else said that he does not care about how he feels and what he will do. After these words asks, is the king really doing this just to specifically draw attention to his person? But the main thing? The hero is surprised to declare that he is not a child to behave like that. At this moment, his soul as if crying, because he himself wants to eat. But then Ruhak looked angrily at the king and said that perhaps he was planning to starve to death so that all his plans would go awry. But the protagonist, who naturally does not plan anything of the sort, immediately loudly declares that this is nonsense. But realizing that he is in a winning situation, and says that if his friend lets him go from here, he will definitely eat something. He promises that he will eat whatever the servants bring him, but he does so only in return for having the chain removed from his leg. He also assures his hand that he will not escape. Suddenly he switches and asks if his friends are saved and asks to see them for a moment. According to the protagonist, these words are a good provocation. But Ruhak looks as if it does not bother him at all, and only wonders if the protagonist realizes in what hopeless situation he is in. In his opinion, the young man is very much mistaken. He thinks the Archduke came here to persuade him to eat something. Realizing that Ruhak really didn't come here for that, the protagonist immediately asks what the purpose of his visit is. And then he learns that even if he doesn't want to eat or simply can't, Ruhak will still force food into his mouth and make him eat it. But before he does, he generously gives the protagonist a choice and tells him that he can start eating himself, or they can do their best to feed the king by force. At the same time, he says that he has another way that will probably work, while he holds the protagonist's hands tightly and says that it seemed to him that those people who came to the kingdom with him are more important to him than even he is. So realizing the importance of friends for the protagonist, the Archduke asks him if he wants to see his friends, and these words frighten the protagonist very much. Immediately afterwards, Ruhak asks the king for advice, noting that he likes the last option more than any other, which naturally makes the protagonist worried. Right after that, the young man realizes that no matter how much he says he can't eat, the Ruhak won't believe his story. So the protagonist immediately picks up an apple in his hand, and in spite of it thinks that he has made a senseless provocation, and he can do nothing against so powerful a man as Ruhak. Realizing that he made a mistake, the protagonist starts eating the apple I took, but he still can't do it and he only blushes. At this point, Ruhak realized that the king really couldn't eat and asked him to stop. But when he continued to pretend as if he could eat the apple, he became furious and grabbed his hand and ordered him to stop again. But the protagonist is not going to give up and says that he will eat this food anyway. Of course, the Archduke realizes that he physically cannot do it and tells the protagonist that he has understood everything, so he can spit it all out of his mouth. To make him spit it all out, the Archduke even put his hands in his mouth to clean out all the food precisely. At this moment, Jobel asks Sonia to do nothing and wait for him. Naturally, the girl is surprised by the visit of this servant and asks what he is doing here, and also wonders how he could leave the king alone. But a frightened servant said that the king was not alone but with the Archduke in his room. At this point, a slightly pissed off Sonia declares that she doesn't like the Archduke's behavior at all. But at this point, a very badly frightened Jobel shuts the girl's mouth and asks if it's okay to be so loud about it. But this still does not calm the girl, and she is still angry and claims that her words are the whole truth. After all, they finally got the king they had been waiting for, but Ruhak himself starts to overreact. According to Sonia, none of them have been resentful of the protagonist for a long time, and at this point in time they are only wondering why he left them. But according to her, they naturally to ask the king directly about it. But immediately after these words, the servant once again accuses the Archduke and says that to keep a man who has just returned locked up like this is a completely wrong thing to do. At which point the servant looks very agitated by these words. The girl even states that if she were the king, she would not want to stay in this empire. At this moment, behind her back appears the loyal knight Ruhak, who naturally heard the whole conversation. He looked at the servants, and they were naturally very much frightened that he had heard their frank talk. Then, deciding to somehow change the subject, they said hello to the knight. But he did not answer anything, just went upstairs. At this point, Ruhak tells the protagonist that he will let him leave this room and allow him to meet with whomever he wants. But he says he can only do so if he is accompanied by Yun Qian. Hearing these words, the protagonist is once again surprised and asks why everything is like this. Because he emphasizes that earlier the Archduke told him quite differently. The Ruhak looked at the protagonist and asked what the big deal was, and also wondered if the king really wanted the Archduke himself to go with him instead of his knight. Hearing this proposal, the protagonist naturally quickly refused and said that he would rather go with the knight in that case. These words made his successor think. At this point, seeing Ruhak's face, the protagonist even thinks that he may have the gift of clairvoyance. But he immediately reassures himself that most likely the Archduke cannot know about his thoughts. At this point, Ruhak says that it would be better if the king will not plan anything bad, and so it is, for this purpose, he will always be followed by a knight who will look after the protagonist. Ruhak also says that the attribute unification will take place tomorrow, and when he hears these words, the protagonist realizes that everything is going perfectly and according to his plan, at which point he even apologizes to Jae-yong, but the attribute unification is exactly what he needs right now. As he leaves the room, Ruhak says he'll send Yuncheon here right away so that the protagonist can finally see his friends. But it turns out, according to the king, that's not the only problem he has. Turns out he's getting curious about obeying his orders. At that moment, he turned around and looked at the knight, who, noticing the king's gaze, immediately lowered his head. Seeing the knight's reaction, the protagonist said that he probably hated him too, but he turned around and said that although his words may sound like common excuses, he didn't leave the empire because he hated his vassals. It was as if he tried to tell the true reason why he left the empire, but something stopped him again, whereupon the knight noticed it and asked the king himself not to tell him his reason. Then the knight raises his head and declares that it makes absolutely no difference to him why the king disappeared, because all that matters to him is that the king has returned, and he emphasizes that all the other vassals think exactly as he does. Then the main character reaches out to the knight and says that he doesn't know what his name was before, but the name Yun Cheon suits him very well. At this moment, the knight looked very calm and said that of course it is so, because this name was given to him by the person he loves most in this world. It turned out that this person is the most important hero. Then realizing that the knight was on his side, he asked if he would help him, to which the knight naturally agreed, and even said that he would do anything. Then the protagonist says that if the knight really trusts him, he'll take him to the treasury right now, at which point the Archduke is informed that correspondence has arrived from the Empire of the Chained. The 10th hero of the Behemoth, Gurnan, also informs Ruhak that apparently there are people among the restrained who have the ability to communicate at a distance. But at this moment, Ruhak doesn't even seem to be listening to his subject. He only notices that the letter brought to him smells like a beast, and it irritates him very much. Immediately after that, he noticed another letter that was also on the table. After he opened it, it turned out that this letter was meant for the main character. The letter stated that someone was asking the king to join a gala banquet to strengthen the friendship and cooperation between the two empires, and informed that the banquet would be held in the Yadin Cavalry Empire. Naturally, Jernin immediately says that since the king is back, this time he will be able to take part in the banquet on his own, but then Rukak says that he is not quite sure about it because he has not yet handed over control of the empire to him. Of course, the 10th of Bohemia was very much surprised by such words, but then the Archduke explained it by the fact that the king has not yet earned the trust, because according to him, he still behaves quite inadequately. The Archduke says he's already asked the king not to do anything stupid, but at this point, it's as if Gernon doesn't know what he's talking about. It turns out that the Archduke went out the window to see what was going on outside, because he sensed the fact that the treasury of his empire was open. Naturally, Gernon was very surprised to hear such words, because he is well aware that the treasury can only be opened by the Archduke, and of course the protagonist. At this point, he finally realized that the protagonist opened the treasury without the approval of the Archduke. At this point, the protagonist is in the treasury looking at what is there. It turns out he is looking for a certain potion that should help him, and opening the box, he is filled with confidence that it is here. At that moment, he sees that the mana potion he was looking for is actually here, and realizes that he needs to drink it because he has very little mana, so it will come in handy. But suddenly it turns out he wasn't looking for this potion, and realizes that even if it's badly laid and useful to him, he should still focus on finding what he was looking for. Realizing that he may be caught then as he rummages through the treasury, the protagonist notices a safe and decides that maybe what he needs is in there. When he starts to open the safe, he is even a little surprised that it opens very easily. Then, looking at what's inside, he sees that there is exactly the potion he was looking for. And we learn that in fact the protagonist was looking for a potion of attribute fusion. But suddenly he realizes that in this case, something is clearly going wrong because everything cannot be so simple. But suddenly he decides that in any case, he must take this potion and quickly leave the treasury. As suddenly behind his back there is a loud explosion that naturally strikes the protagonist. At that moment, through the smoke, he saw two figures, one of whom was the knight who had brought him here and the Archduke, who grabbed him by the throat to emphasize the fact that he had warned the knight not to do such foolish things. Naturally, Rukak is very angry while the protagonist watches in amazement, but Rukak, at the same time still holding the knight by the throat, says that from now on, this means that he will explain his instructions to the knight in a different way. The Archduke also states that he thinks he has been generous enough to his knight, but immediately declares that such a thing will never happen again. At this point, in order to save his loyal friend and knight, the protagonist intervenes in their conflict and calls out to Ruhak. At this point, he finally releases the throat of the gasping knight and looks at the king. But the knight doesn't want to put the protagonist in harm's way and says that everything that happened is his fault. Upon hearing these words, Rukak said that the knight was indeed to blame, but immediately asked the king how he had managed to open the treasury. At this point, the protagonist states that it opened on its own, and he wasn't going to do anything but just take some magic potion. Then the Archduke grabbed the protagonist by the throat and said that everything was clear to him, but immediately emphasized that he did not authorize him to do so. Immediately after these words, he grabbed the boy by the arm and said that his walk was over, but also said that for such a misdemeanor, he would imprison the knight in the dungeon. Then the protagonist did not agree with such an outcome and asked the Archduke not to jump to conclusions because the knight had brought him here only because he had asked him to do so himself. According to him, prison is too harsh a punishment for such a misdemeanor, for it was his own fault for telling the knight to bring him to the treasury. After a while, the Ruhak threw the protagonist on the bed again. He towered over him and angrily emphasized that the protagonist had already stabbed him in the back a huge number of times. According to him, the king has not changed, because he behaves exactly as he did before, according to Ruhak Empire, which was abandoned by the protagonist and then returned to it does not deserve such behavior. At this point, he holds the protagonist tightly by the throat and presses his head into a pillow. He says that's exactly what happened the moment the protagonist disappeared. According to him, at that moment, the protagonist only confessed his love and ran away somewhere. He believes that such actions are a complete shamelessness on the part of the king. At this point, he began to touch the wings of the protagonist again. But then he looked at Ruhak and said that after the Archduke's response at the time, it was even more shameless than his behavior to stay in this empire. At this point, Ruhak looked a little confused. He asked the protagonist if the reason he left the empire and left it to its fate was really only because of the answer he received then. According to the Archduke then, it was not only his answer to the king, but also the answer he received from the whole empire. At that moment, he grabbed the protagonist by the face and said that if he asked him to answer honestly and not to hide anything, he had to be ready for such an answer. But at that moment, he decides to mock the king and asks him if he understood correctly that he apparently wanted to hear a completely different answer. At first, the boy didn't quite understand what the Archduke meant, but after Ruhak started unbuttoning his clothes, it all became much clearer to him. The Archduke himself also said that if the king's love means sharing his body, he can understand it perfectly well. He even states that he noticed this manifestation of love last time. According to him, he is well aware of the fact that the protagonist prefers touch language more than anything else, and so he threw off all the clothes of the protagonist. After a while, you could see how much the protagonist's face contorted, and for the pleasure he was taking in that moment. It turned out that Ruhak was gently touching the protagonist's back, which made him squirm so much. Naturally, he even asked his Archduke to stop. It turns out that all this time, Ruhak also kissed the back of the protagonist and left a lot of marks on his back. But at this moment, the protagonist's face suddenly changed even more. He opened his eyes in surprise and his hands clutched the pillow. At this point, he frantically began to beg Ruhak not to touch his wings, because he said he didn't like it at all. He even tries to use physical force and push the stronger Archduke away, because he says his wings are hurting him. But the Ruhak didn't even think of stopping, and began to rub his wings even harder against the king's wings, at which point he begged him to stop. But once again, his words had no effect on his subordinate's actions, and he just continued to do so while the king still begged to be released. At this point, the level of tenderness between them increased to the limit, because the Archduke to one place that the protagonist has is even more sensitive than his wings. And for all that was going on, he felt very strange, but he still felt great pleasure. He was obviously enjoying this pastime. After the Archduke saw that there was no more strength left in the protagonist for this, he finally let him go on the bed. Naturally, he immediately asked if the king really liked all this so much, but the protagonist was only very much surprised by this question. Suddenly, in a fit of passion, the protagonist called the Archduke Nell this word. He grabbed the protagonist by the throat and asked him never to say this name again. According to him, the king did not deserve it, and then he emphasized that thanks to his efforts, he had already lost the name twice. Suddenly, the protagonist began to cry, which naturally surprised Ruhak, who immediately asked if he was the only one in this situation. Dear friends, and if you want to see the continuation of this story, then be sure to subscribe to the channel, put likes under this video, and do not forget to click on the bell to not miss new videos. And the next part will be released when under this one will be 40,000 views or 5,000 likes.